Welcome everyone, settle in. We've got we're a few moments away, but if you're looking for benchmarking your business metrics for digital transformation, a webinar proudly sponsored by Coupa, then you've come to the right place. While you're settling in, hope you've got a nice drink and something to eat, or wherever you may be in the world, you may not already had lunch. Please get on the chat bar and tell us where you're from today. We're very keen to hear from you and use this opportunity to engage with others that are coming onto the webinar. Not long now. Welcome, Michael from Sydney. Let's see if we can get further afield. And Auckland. Welcome, Matt. And Michael from Vancouver. I think that's about the furthest. You're cheating. Welcome, everyone. Settle in. You've come to the webinar, the CIPS webinar sponsored by Coupa, benchmarking your business metrics for digital transformation. We'll give it another minute for people to join. Welcome from Jakarta in Indonesia. Just hit the hours, so people are joining us now. Welcome. And please use the chat function to tell us where you're from. Nice to have you from Singapore. Welcome. And the Philippines. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the CIPS webinar, proudly sponsored by Coupa, benchmarking your business metrics for digital transformation. I'd like to let everyone know that this webinar is currently being recorded and it will be made available for all attendees the following week. So if you missed some of those vital bits, you'll be able to rewatch it next week. Firstly, I would like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to those elders past and present. I'd also like to extend our respects to the Maori, Pacifica, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples here today. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa to our New Zealand neighbours. My name is Sharon Morris and I'm the General Manager for CIPS Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. And I'm very pleased to be here today to present this webinar. A little bit about CIPS before I hand you over to our specialists today. For those of you who don't know us, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, or better known as CIPS, is your global professional body for procurement and supply professionals. We're dedicated to promoting best practice, continuous improvement in professional standards, and raising awareness of the contribution that you all make and that procurement and supply management can make to organisations, but also to the community at large. CIPS is a very proud partner to be partnering with Coupa Software, the global leader in cloud-based business spend management software, and who are bringing you today's webinar. We have more than 150 people registered for this session today, so it's great to see such a high level of interest centred on this important topic, Coupa's 2022 benchmarking report. We are joined today by Coupa's CPO, Michael van Keulen, and CBRE's Global Procurement Head, ESG, Matt Langley. So a warm welcome to you both. Before I let Michael and Matt take over, a bit of housekeeping. You've all been muted during the presentation. However, please, as I mentioned before, use the chat box to refer any comments, tell us where you're from or what your current thoughts are on this topic. And make sure you choose all panelists and all attendees so that everyone can see your comments. And then if you have any specific questions that you wish to be addressed, which we'll address straight after the presentation, then please use the Q&A box. I'm going to hand over to Michael now, who will talk to some of the 20 community-powered KPIs for best-in-class performance across procurement, risk, invoicing and payments from the 2022 benchmarking report. Following this, Matt will share CBRE's journey and business spend metrics through digital transformation. Welcome, Michael, and over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. And I just wanted to say it's a great pleasure to be here. If there's one thing that we practitioners like, it's benchmarking your own performance and starting to really understand how you compare yourself to best in class. So this is especially a topic that I and we at Coupa get extremely passionate about. So if you feel we get passionate, that's because we are passionate about metrics. And it's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Michael van Keulen. I'm the Chief Procurement Officer. I should probably say the proud Chief Procurement Officer here at Coupa. And so yeah, so we're excited to get going. But before we get started, it might be a good idea just to get a little bit of context into who we are as Coupa. This by no means is a sales pitch. I know us practitioners don't necessarily always enjoy that, but it is important that we just put a little bit of a perspective. So, when we think about digital transformation and the journey, you will likely hear, the term business spend management, and they definitely come hand in hand. But these are just a few key statistics that you see here on the screen. We have well over 2,500. I think we're actually now have more than 3,000 customers, and they are some of the most leading companies in the world. And you can see some of the logos on the screen. We have more than 7 million suppliers. Those numbers grow by roughly 30% a year, just purely because of the architecture and the native, the nature of our platform. And we control well over $3 trillion worth of spend on the Coupa platform. Now, we often resonate with being a solution for streamlined procurement, but I think it's important that the audience understands that, we manage all business spending, whether it's from sourcing to procurement, to supplier management, employee expenses, supplier invoices, supply chain, all the way down to payment. And there's, of course, plenty of automation that we can manage there. And there's a lot of different steps that you can manage in between, such as risk, but it's all centered, what you see in the middle there, around the user, adoption. And that's why we are growing at the pace that we are. It's all centered around the user and drives that adoption, and the user is really centered to that. And, this can all be managed in one single line of code platform that is truly integrated, and it allows you to extract true end-to-end spend visibility in a very seamless way. When we think about digital transformation, we at Coupa like to think about it in 3 different steps. The first one, of course, is how do you optimize spend and how do you optimize your cash? We'd like to think of that as more like how do you extract the most amount of value out of your spending and out of your business spend management process. The second element is how do you improve your operational performance? Think about administrative complexity. How do you streamline what we like to maybe refer to as the downstream process, the procure to pay or direct to PO and PO to pay, and how do we simplify that? And then the third element is how do you take out risk? And obviously reducing risk is something that is extremely, extremely relevant in today's environment. It has always been relevant, but especially in an environment today where disruption is the new normal, and where we have to manage disruption across our supply chain. You also see the mobile capabilities there on your screen, and it is important. When we think about digital transformation, it can only be successful if it's very, very user friendly. And you see here that in one single mobile app, you can manage your expenses, you can manage your approvals, you can manage your requisitions. And just think about it, what it does for your organization if you can do that all in one very intuitive, seamless way. we do understand that businesses are not always looking at fully automating all the areas of spend right out of the gate. But it is important that you look at digital transformation holistically, and that you do look at it end to end, especially as you think about scalability. Point solutions are great. They're good for quick fixes. Trust me, I've been there. I've bought analytics, and I've only bought sourcing and just a CLM platform. I've done that in the past. I've been doing this for 20 years. But it gets complicated. And, we generally believe in one fully integrated platform. Hence why we're here today to talk about, KPIs, and especially if you can do that in one big, intelligent, community-based platform. And that is really the key. That's what sets us apart. And we're here together today to really share with you some of these business spend management KPIs. So if we move further on, just to pause here a second, right? The intent of today is really to talk about business spend management, key KPIs, and we are really proud to present these. These comes directly from our community. They are community-based. They are best-in-class performances across procurement, risk, invoicing, expenses, payments, and we're going to go through these KPIs in more detail. They're based on hard, real data. These are real transactions from real companies doing real business with real suppliers. And this is what we call the community data, or the power of community intelligence in Coupa. And they are available to all of our customers directly in your platform. You can directly leverage the power of these KPIs and start benchmarking your own performance. And we're happy to go into more detail offline. But each benchmark is really represents the median values of the top quartile. So it's important to what we're about to go through. These are the median values of the top quartile of Coupa customers across industries, across geographies. And these are the median values. We can also share them per industry. So if you are interested in understanding these KPIs for your respective industry, whether you're in finance, in retail, in manufacturing, or anything else, we do have them. And we're always happy to share, because at Coupa, we always believe in none of us is as smart as all of us. And so we're always all about sharing. But if we maybe go to the next slide, so we can start digging in, this is where it gets really exciting. As a practitioner, one of my key metrics has always been, and again, I've done this for a while, is how much spend do I have on contract? And the reason why that is relevant is it means that procurement has played a role in that specific spend. We've typically run a competitive process. We have normally gone through vetting suppliers and gone through things like risk and contract, but on contract spend has always been a key metric for me. The best in class companies within the top quartile again gets to almost 80% of spend under contract. And the way I'd encourage the audience to look at these metrics is, where are you when it comes to on contract spend? And for me, on contract spend has probably been one of my top three key KPIs. The next one that we can look at is structured spend. And what structured spend really means is, has that gone through a hosted or a vendor hosted catalog? Some people refer to this as punch outs. We'd like to think about punch out a little bit differently than maybe traditionally people looked at punch outs, where you have to go to some third-party catalog and bring it back into your P2P solution. But think about 64.8% of that can be structured. So, again, think about it, and it allows you to optimize the spend and drive more value. But equally important, it also allows you to optimize your cash, which is extremely important in today's environment. We don't have to explain where the cost of capital is going. I think we can all see it with inflation rates being double digits, where interest rates are going. So think about, how do you optimize your cash and your working capital? And then the third one that we're looking at here is your contract management cycle times. So if you can complete a contract from the moment procurement gets that contract or takes that contract in to the point that you can get fully executed contract to 8.1 business days, that really operationalizes your procurement process, and it really allows you to be that competitive advantage for your business. If we go to the next slide, and yes, the slides will be shared, absolutely. If we go to the next slide, an important one to refer that I've always enjoyed is rec to PO cycle time. How quickly can procurement move a requisition, so a request from the business to be purchasing whatever it is that they need to run their business, to a purchase order? If you do that in several business days, then the chances of the business trying to avoid or circumvent the procurement process are pretty significant. If you're able to do that, however, in a couple business hours, there's no reason for the business to try to to circumvent or to figure out a different way to get whatever they need to run their business and execute their strategic objectives. So it's really important that you can do that very quickly. Even more importantly is, I've always said that approving an invoice is kind of a waste of time. What you'd rather be doing is focus your time and attention on pre-approving spend. Because a pre-approved spend, of course, you can still influence. You can make sure it goes to the right buying channels. You can make sure it goes to the right supplier with the right pricing, the right SLA, the right quality, with maybe the right risk profile. Maybe diversity is important. ESG is important. We're going to talk about it in a second with Matt. So think about that. If you can do that, it again allows you to drive more value. And electronic PO processing, of course, something that speaks for itself. If you can get to 99% of electronic PO processing directly with your suppliers without having to potentially touch that purchase order, it of course focuses on improving your operational performance. We'll go to the next slide. I really want to go through these. I mean, we'll email these, you can read them. But electronic invoicing, right? We just talked about pre-approved spend. If you then have your supplier flip that purchase order into an invoice, and you fully digitize your invoice. So we're not talking about OCRing an invoice through a scanning engine. We're talking about a fully digital invoice. It just takes away your administrative complexity. First time match rate, I think, speaks for itself. But improve your approval cycle times. If you can accelerate your approval cycle times for your invoices, now you can actually focus on when you decide to pay that invoice, potentially acceleration of your payments, potentially capitalizing on early payment discounts. Maybe you even want to think about supply chain finance, but really allowing to do that in 11 business hours. Again, reflect it back on your own business. How quickly today can you approve an invoice? And maybe more importantly, your electronic invoicing. What percent of your invoices is today received fully electronic without potentially needing anyone with your hands to touch them? Then if we go to the next one, and I do want to spend more time on Q&A, and of course give Matt a chance to really talk about all the amazing stuff that he has in his toolkit. But think about risk. If you think about risk and the evaluation of risk and how quickly can you complete a full risk assessment, really, really critical. And how quickly can you do that? So 37.4 business hours. So if my math is correct, it's a little less than 5 business days. I think I can still do 5 times 8 at 7 p.m. at night. Again, it just allows you to reduce risk, but maybe more importantly, you're not going to bog down the business. We really, really focus on operational excellence, and the faster you're able to support the business, the higher the likelihood is that the business wants to come to you and considers you a strategic partner and a business weapon, and really wants to engage with you. And I think that's where honestly digitization has helped me in my past at the companies I've had the pleasure of working for previously. It just becomes your catalyst. This is your vehicle that allows you to go from level 2 to level 4 procurement and really help the business move forward. And then I think we're at almost to the tail end of the KPIs. If we go to the last one, this is a critical one, and it's a great pivot to also move over to Matt. But think about spend with diverse suppliers. We all know that ESG is a board conversation. Your investors are asking for it. Your chief executive officer has targets. Your C-suite is focused on it. Your customers are asking for it. Equally important, your employees are asking for it. So if you have the ability to properly influence the spend and make sure it goes to the right suppliers that are truly classified as diverse, you could actually get to 23.9% or almost 24% of spend with diverse suppliers. And again, besides that de-risking your supply chain, it drives innovation. It's proven, having true ESG, and I don't want to take too much away from Matt, but this is really a key critical element and enabler. So 23.9% is what the top quartile is able to achieve. I can talk about these metrics for hours. I know that's not the intent, but we hope this was meaningful and relevant. I'm now gonna, we still had a last slide. See, I even forget some of these metrics, but expenses, think about your expenses, your T&E process, how quickly can you approve those? 6.5 business hours for expense report approval cycle time. So that's the average time that an expense report, when it's entered into the system to the time it's approved. 6.5 business hours, again, reflected back in your own organization. And then, compliance, right? I mean, if you think about policy compliance, 98%, the percentage of lines that meet policy limits within expense reports, just think about that, right? I mean, it reduces risk. It also helps you with compliance rates. It helps you with governance and oversight, really, really critical when it comes to T&E. So yeah, I mean, some really key critical benchmarks that we want to share. If we flick to the next slide. So that's my part of the conversation. Of course, we're going to get to Q&A later, but I do definitely want to head it over to Matt with CBRE. CBRE is a trusted partner and part of our Coupa community and a proud Coupa community member. But I want to hand it over to Matt. Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm Matt Langley, the Global Procurement Head for ESG. And so within CBRE, most of you may know CBRE, but for those that don't, CBRE is the largest real estate company globally. And within that, we do a lot around facilities management. So managing office blocks and warehouses and key assets of our clients. We also do a lot around lease and transactions. We do a lot around project management, so fit outs and construction. And we do residential and industrial construction as well. So that's important for us from a carbon and ESG perspective, because 40% of carbon emissions come from the built environment, and CBRE being the largest in that. And also within our large client base, almost half of our clients have a net zero goal, whereas it's 2025 ranging to 2050, but everyone's on that journey to decarbonize themselves. So one thing I do like about talking about ESG is you can have nice pictures on there, and so yeah, we like to think through nature and how all that comes through. So next slide, please. However, you can't forget where we've come from and what our focus has been. So within Coupa, we've had the partnership since 2018, and within Procure to Pay, and we're kind of stretching that out into the risk aspects and our supplier onboarding and other areas. And so for us, we branded Coupa internally as MyBuy, and having previously been the global head of technology and operations for procurement, we set up dashboards that really focused those metrics that Michael went through down into specific dashboards, tracking how much we spend with preferred suppliers and what countries, how many suppliers we're using, the cycle time for an invoicing, which suppliers are we working with, so that we're able to really make that data come alive, and ensure that we can have outreach programs with our shared service center folks that can work with suppliers to get them onto electronic invoicing, to work with them to improve their risk. And now that starts setting us up much better for the next more complicated discussions around ESG and what that means for them. So we are looking to pivot a little bit away from a dashboard per application to a dashboard per stakeholder group, so that we can then pull out our data coming together from the different areas and just be able to provide what we need for that stakeholder, and some elements Procure to Pay and source to contract and diversity and sustainability, bring all that together. And so I'll explain a little bit more of that later on. Next slide, please. So I like to think about the sustainability evolution that we've been going through. And for me, this started doing a master's in sustainable development through Imperial College in sort of early 2000. And at that point, everyone was talking about corporate social responsibility. It's about really how do we, as a large business or as businesses, how do we have a positive influence on the world? And so they talked about volunteering, foundations, and a number of projects that looked at, reducing single-use plastics in your office, wastewater and energy type projects that really helped your direct emissions or your spend with utilities, and so your electricity spend. So for me, I think that is a good place to start, and it gets you on the journey. It's not moved the needle. The carbon emissions have continued to grow in the atmosphere. We're feeling a lot more of it. And so a couple of years ago for CBRE, we started thinking more, okay, well, how do we start measuring things, and how do we start putting data points in there? And so we started thinking about, well, how much do we spend with sustainable and diverse suppliers? And what does that mean in what the definitions are? And this is where we started partnering with different groups. So for sustainability, we partnered with EcoVadis that does sustainability assessments of companies, CBRE inclusive, and a number of our clients. And we've been working with a number of our supply partners to go through that journey as well. It is expensive. It's a lot cheaper than trying to go and get a consultancy and to develop a sustainability program for you. But yeah, there are some costs associated with that. And then from a supplier diversity perspective, we partnered with Coupa's Connexus and looking to identify companies that have registered with different diversity agencies and bring that in. And so what that has meant for us is that we're now able to track with using our spend cube and these extra data sources, how much do we spend with sustainable suppliers? Well, it's about 3 billion at the moment of our 30 billion that we track through our finance systems and our key clients' finance systems, and 1.3 billion with diverse suppliers. And we have goals to meet 4 billion this year and 8 billion of sustainable spend by 2026. And 1.6 billion this year with diverse suppliers, up to 3 billion by 2026 as well. That's not quite got us where we want to get to, though. Those terms are still a bit too broad, and we want to focus down. And so we're moving to what I'm calling the third evolution, which is thinking about ESG, so environment, social, and governance. And from an environment perspective, we're looking really at how do we decarbonize the supply chain. From a social perspective, it's about supplier diversity, and that feeds into spending more money with underrepresented groups and the social benefits that come from that. And then the responsible sourcing. So we cannot get away from risk. We don't want to promote a diverse supplier that has a modern-day slavery issue, or a solar panel installer that then doesn't have a health and safety policy and procedure and has an accident. So that governance is still super important, and the compliance and the health and safety and the risk and the cybersecurity, all of that, we still need to keep a total focus on. As you go through these three journeys, data becomes more and more important, and the metrics become more and more important through that. There is a fourth evolution that some people talk about planetary boundaries, and you start not looking just at carbon, you look at some biomass and nitrogen and other areas. And that's where the Sustainable Development Goals come in and start giving you some ideas of areas to focus. I see that as a bit too theoretical at the moment, and just trying to solve for carbon and these other areas is going to be enough for us to focus on right now. So for the next slide, we start breaking ESG down. Sorry, next slide. Yeah, so for us, then our vision within ESG is how do we build a low carbon, sustainable, ethical, and diverse supply chain that will protect the planet, drive economic growth, and uplift communities. So you'll see here that we're starting to move away from our supply chain is about cost reduction and supplier performance to a lot broader and wider view around what we can do with our supply chain, and resilience start coming in here, and working within more localizing aspects. We're shifting away from a period of peace and driving geopolitical connections and standards to much more of a complicated world geopolitically, and so we need to understand that that's going to impact our supply chain and the way we look at things. So it's not going to be as simple as it was before for us in procurement, that it's all about cost, and it's all about cost reduction and performance of suppliers. So decarbonizing the supply chain becomes super important. So we want to be able to understand the size of emissions in our supply chain, where that comes from, the hotspots that we want to start working with those suppliers. We want to work with more diverse suppliers, so understanding where we are doing well in that, where we've got gaps, and how do we close those gaps and work with more diverse suppliers. As Michael said, it is a key ESG aspect to look at. A diverse supplier brings in diverse thinking. It helps the local communities. Generally, they're smaller, and so they're more flexible. They're more resilient, and if they've got sustainability aspects in there, they're a lower risk because they've got more policies and procedures and processes in place. So yeah, there's a great business case around every million you spend from a procurement perspective, diversified, you get 3.4 million back. And then can't forget about the responsible sourcing. So I kind of went into key aspects there. And here we try to understand what is the inherent risk of our supplier. So that we're looking to onboard. Is it that they have access to confidential information, or they have cybersecurity risk, and we need to manage that? Do they work at heights or confined spaces? Health and safety risk, we need to manage that. Are they a government representative or some sort of conflict coming in that their relation to the person wanting to onboard them, or CBRE, or they're a compliance risk? The politically exposed people, we want to make sure we don't have that. So all of those aspects still need to be critical and have those kind of foundation aspects. So I think that's kind of covering the journey we've been on and where we are now. And we really see that this really is a journey, and it's interesting being in the middle of the supply chain. So we've got our clients, as I said, just under half of our large clients, large global clients, basically the S&P 500, have net zero goals and diversity goals that they want us to work with them on. And then we've got a lot of our suppliers as well that some have started on this journey. And so how do we work with our clients and work with our suppliers to really improve the journey that we're on, and ultimately from a carbon perspective is to stay within the 1.5 degree increase average that the Paris Accord is looking for. But the other aspect is really to provide transparency in our supply chain. There's some German regulation that's coming into force the 1st of January that starts making CBRE and large corporates in Germany responsible for everything that happens in our supply chain, not just our direct suppliers, but their suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers, from a carbon and labor and human rights. And so we need to build that transparency and understand where the risks are in our supply chain and how we're going to manage those, and how can we work through that supply chain with those supply partners. So Michael, back to you.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Some really good questions. Maybe I'll take one right now, just real quick. I think one of the questions is, does our data reveal a standout sector that consistently performs better than maybe others? I think the way to look at it is, this is the top quartile. We do have metrics per industry. The way that this report works, just maybe for a little bit of clarity, we anonymize the spend. So we, of course, we can never, so it's always anonymized. It never is traced back to suppliers or to customers, excuse me. And the sample set needs to be big enough so that it, with data, of course, as we all know, the bigger the data set becomes, the more reliable the data becomes and the more meaningful. So there is not a specific industry that, far outpaces the others. And again, I'm happy to share, we don't have this in a beautiful report, but I got it in Excel. But you do need to think about, like, if you, for example, in high tech, like myself at Coupa, I'm a practitioner, I do manage our spend. A pretty significant portion of my spend is, of course, in hosting. And, that, for example, is, obviously with AWS in our case, and that's by default is not diverse, right? So therefore, my percentage diverse spend is not maybe as good as in others. When you're, for example, in retail, they typically have quite a lot of diverse suppliers, but maybe the dollars are not super significant. So it's industry specific. There are some nuances. When you're in heavy services, then maybe you don't really have a lot of structured spend because you don't typically do that in a punch-out catalog. So there's some industry nuances, and we're happy to share it. It's a great question. But before we're heading over to, go ahead.
Sorry, to add a comment to that, because I found that interesting. I know I've used your metrics to try and drive change within CBRE, and I think it's useful to keep it on those averages in some ways, because your industry and the history of your company will have strengths and weaknesses, and so you'll be higher in some areas, but you'll be lower in others. Ultimately, though, you actually want to aim for the top quartile. Obviously, not everyone can be in the top quartile, otherwise it wouldn't be there. But that then will show, look, we need all of these aspects, and some of them will take a longer journey to get up to the top quartile. Some of them we should already be there. And there's cultural differences and country differences. Like we find it difficult in Australia on the electronic invoicing, which I thought it'd be super easy. But we're tracking at about 30% electronic invoicing in Australia, whereas globally we have a target of 70%, and we're pretty much there. So there's some historical reasons why Australia has been a bit more advanced, and so are less inclined to do electronic invoicing. But then catalog aspects can come through. So yeah, I think it's useful knowing the industry, but really you shouldn't just judge on that. You should look at, well, what can other companies do, and how do I emulate not just the best in my industry, but the best across.
No, I love that. No, I love that. I definitely love that. But I'm just saying, like, the nature of your spend sometimes,
for sure.
If you're heavy services, for example. But I think overall, I agree. I would strive to be the best in every single category, knowing that might be, striving for excellence, right? This is how we call it. So I do agree with your perspective. Hey, but before we hand it over to Sharon for audience Q&A, there are two questions that I have for you, Matt. The first one is, can you describe how CBRE is planning on decarbonizing the supply chain?
Yeah, so interesting question. Thank you for that. So it's not an easy one. It's going to be a long journey. But effectively, what we're looking at doing, which is following what a few industry leaders have done, and Shell is actually quite a good example here, that we are taking our spend cube and we are looking to then match that to emissions factors. So every industry, you've got certain governments and universities and things that have come up with an emissions factor for real estate, for cleaning, for professional services, and then we make sure, and we spend a good year getting all of our data together into a spend cube. Stuff that's not going through Coupa, we struggle with more than what's in Coupa, and making that accurate, and then we can work through with emissions factors to identify the hotspots, and then we're starting to work with those suppliers, getting them to register with EcoVadis and getting them started on the sustainability journey. And then we're coming back to them and saying, okay, you're high on the carbon emissions, and so what are you doing to reduce your emissions? Are you using renewable energy, and working with them on projects? And so we're looking for some technology that will help take us on that journey, some SaaS solutions, and Coupa has elements that we're keen to leverage, not quite a full solution at the moment, but we hope within the next 12 months that you'll have that, and we can look to leverage that more. And so that then means that we're able to get a baseline, which is about 20 million tons of CO2, which if we tried to offset that, it's about 1 billion that would need to offset. Most of that, pretty much all of that is our clients that we spend on behalf of our clients, but there is some of that within our corporate. And then if you include where we track some of our scope 2, which is the electricity spend of our clients, we get up to almost 1/3 of China's emissions per annum is being managed by CBRE. So yeah, we've got baseliners first, and then start working through metrics, and then start working through how do we look to reduce that down on an ongoing basis.
No, makes total sense. And I would say that, you guys are definitely moving the needle, or, raising the bar for us in Coupa in terms of, supporting you in the journey. So, you guys are definitely right up there in terms of pushing us forward. So we appreciate that. And then the second question I have is, what is your data strategy and your plans to use key metrics?
Yeah, so it's interesting that the data journey is sometimes more important than other aspects. So yes, in bringing in Coupa, you get all those efficiencies and improvements that we talked about, but you start getting that clarity of data, which I think is underestimated how important that is. And the metrics you're showing, right? Then you start being able to compare it and see where you are. And otherwise, you don't know whether you're doing very well and versus the top tier or not. So for us, we've got a core data strategy that we're bringing together our spend information and our operational information, and we run that, and every month we try and improve that. So the rationalizing our vendor names and trying to simplify that, to making sure we've got the spend going in the right category, spend categories, and so using more catalogs. And you kind of talked about like the spend channel and things that we want to make sure that we're kind of covering that, and the on contract starts even becoming more important, right? Because we want to be able to manage that. So all the stuff you were talking about earlier, you need to come through and just think that's the foundations we've got to get right to build into our data journey. And then what we're doing now is really bringing insights in. So we've connected with Connexus for diversity, a Coupa company, and then we can say, okay, now we know how much we spend with diverse suppliers. We connect with EcoVadis, and we connect with the emissions factors, and we connect with square foot data. So what is the cost per square foot? And that starts providing insights to us that we can then take further and offer savings and risk areas and what we can do more. So we haven't quite got the predictive analytics that our global executives want to drive us to. I'm not sure where there's some of the sourcing and procurement people are ready for some of that predictive analytics. It is really the next phase, but at the moment we're pretty happy with providing those insights and then driving that through the organization.
Yeah. No, that's great. No, thank you for sharing. And EcoVadis is one of those, key partners to Coupa as well in terms of integrating it. And of course, the benefit of having an open platform is you can, enrich the data, is what we say, right? And just make that data even more meaningful for you. So no, thanks for sharing. So with that, Sharon, I think we're ready to take some Q&A for either Matt or myself. So I don't know what questions came in, but we're ready, and ask us anything you want. I mean, we're here.
Yeah, fantastic. Got quite a few questions coming in. Thanks, Michael, for your overview and also for your presentation, Matt. And it's great to see CBRE is leading in the supplier diversity space. You've got, is it a Indigenous Centre of Excellence where you're increasing your supplier diversity? I've noticed over the last couple of years. So hats off to that. It's really good strategy. Question from Andrew. Are there any checks/verification on the suppliers to ensure that they meet the diversity criteria? Perhaps you, Matt, or Michael.
Yeah, there are. So the way that we do it is using Coupa's Connexus. They link to the agencies, and there's a large number around the world. It's most developed in the US, but in Australia, you've got Supply Nation is a great example. And we pull the data out of, or Connexus pulls the data out of Supply Nation, and then we are able to effectively send our spend cube to Connexus, and they link up, yep, these are diverse suppliers, and then we bring that back into a dashboard that we monitor. So there is certifications, there's agencies that kind of manage those certifications, and then Coupa's Connexus and us kind of link to those agencies.
And a good shout out to Supply Nation, who are just today over at Sydney's ICC are exhibiting a number of Indigenous suppliers where corporates and various organisations can meet Indigenous suppliers. So good organisation. And then there's, of course, Social Traders, the Keener Foundation, and a number of organisations that can help you out in that space. From Alex, he says, hey Matt, great prezzo. Will you apply the processes to comply to the German requirements to other markets?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the transparency in the supply chain is going to become more and more important. And so what I see, there's some research that, well, a lot of research that's come out that's saying that companies, I think like 40% reckon that they've got sight of their tier 2, so not your direct suppliers, but the next suppliers. I'm like, show me these companies. I can't find anyone that really had decent access to their supplier. So, but I see it as becoming more and more important. So as we go through the carbon journey, which is really the critical aspect for now, then we are trying to build that that transparency and go through that supply chain. But it starts going exponential, right? That we're looking at getting to 5,000 of our suppliers, which would be about 3% that we see high emissions in. And then those suppliers, if we go out to their top 100, and then those ones top 50, and then those ones top 10, then you're kind of getting into the hundreds of millions of suppliers. So yeah, it's going to be complex. I am hopeful that our supply chain is relatively shallow, 3 or 4 tiers. But I've got a bit scared when I've heard some stats from like Roche from medical equipment, or the manufacturers like HP of IT. They can go 10 to 12 deep in their supply chain. So this is a long journey, and yeah, but we need to go through it.
Thanks, Matt. Michael, perhaps a question for you. Have you found any benchmarking value from analysing line items, price, in brackets, data from e-invoice detail?
Well, I mean, maybe the question is here around category management. I'm not sure exactly who's asking the question, but I'm going to try. I think where the biggest opportunity is for at least as you drive category management, that's maybe where the question is going, is how do I compare my pricing with that of out of the community? That is where I believe, the biggest power can come from, right? If I know at the point of raising a requisition that I'm about to buy something, and I can leverage and harness the power of community as I actually place that requisition at the line item level, that's maybe where the question is going. That would be extremely powerful. Our platform is not entirely there yet. But that is certainly the direction where it's going, right? If you think about harnessing the power of community, if I can do that at line item level on an invoice and start extracting, from the community what pricing should be based upon that community intelligence, I think that there's a lot of value that I can unlock. So I'm not sure if that's where the question was going, but that's definitely where I see the power of community at play. I'm not sure if that's where the question was going, but I hope that answer made sense.
Please let us know in the chat.
I've got another use case for that. So what we're doing in Australia is that we've been able to get a database of labour rates, and so that then helps us kind of that line item, if we're able to kind of clearly in rate cards around what are the right labour rates for us to pay. So we don't want to pay too much. But we also don't want to pay too little, because then you start getting in the modern day slavery issue. And so that database is there. We're using in Australia. We're trying to get a global one. And I'm trying to push to basically set up a bot that is effectively a Coupa buyer as part of the approval chain, that they come in, and if there's a labour rate there, that bot goes out to that labour database, checks the labour rate to make sure it's okay, and brings it back and approves it. So that we're able to then start understanding that line item and pull out that labour rate, pull out some of the other information, and do that. We can't do that within our finance systems, because, and I say systems because we've got a lot of them, that often the invoice information gets cut off because they've got only like 30 characters or something that can be there. And so you can't do it through the finance system. You've got to do it in Coupa. That kind of has that unlimited amount, and you can pull that data through. But yeah, we're thinking that labour rates would be a great one. The products, we want to do through catalogues, but we do find that there is quite a lot of labour rates that come off rate cards. And so there's a use case we've got.
Yeah, that's a great example. Actually, that's really nice.
Thanks, Matt. We're moving over to the Q&A box. So if you can put your questions in the Q&A box, we've got quite a few there. One from our old friend, Giovanni. Are there categories of spend where you struggle to find suppliers that meet social and environmental requirements? If yes, how do you address this challenge?
I think that's one for me. And yeah, absolutely, we find and it's going to be a bit industry specific. So our OEMs, the likes of Keulen for vertical lifts, and really those big global manufacturers we struggle with. So we're trying to look at the dealer network and whether we can ensure that working with diverse dealers. We find certain areas that, like cleaning and security within CBRE, is much more open for diverse suppliers. Although what we've found is that the way CBRE runs our procurement process, and all the large corporates will be the same, we actually we put extra barriers in for diverse suppliers. We have massive scope. We try and consolidate more spend. We try and add more to the geography, and then we kind of consolidate with fewer suppliers, right? So that's the way that we've been taught, is like leverage spend, fewer suppliers, and then you've got a better outcome with cost savings. Well, that doesn't work for a diverse supplier, because often they are, privately owned. They are good in certain areas or certain geographies. And so we tilt the RFP away, so they can't really come back and cover the entire scope you're after in geography. We then make sure that they have to have massive amounts of insurance. We get them into our supply base, and then we never help them go further and sell anymore. So they've got to have a huge sales team. And then we make them jump through hoops for health and safety and ESG and all these other things. And so you've got to think through, and you've got to almost be unprocurement, get rid of that bias that you've got around consolidating spend, and actually think, well, how do I break this up and then give pockets out, and then spend more time and effort actually to work with those suppliers and develop them. So maybe they don't win the first couple of RFPs, but you feed back to them and they understand it, and then they win the third and fourth, and then you grow them from that. So it's really a supplier development process that requires more time and effort. So you do want to check which categories are going to have the biggest potential, and some will just be difficult, and others will be a bit easier.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Good answer. And I think the next question might be going along the same lines, but I'm going to read it out anyway, and you might want to build on it. Often when we hear about supplier diversity and also ensuring your supply chain supports ESG goals, I think that it means switching suppliers to ones that help meet those goals. But as you said, Matt, there is also an approach that is working with existing suppliers who are willing to change or improve to better meet ESG objectives of the companies they supply. What are some of the ways in which procurement roles can impact suppliers in this way? Are there any other ways that you can expand on that?
Yeah, look, it's a lot easier to become a supplier and make them sustainable than it is to make them diverse, especially if they're listed. They're like, well, there's no option there. So if you have a supplier and you can work with them to bring in a joint venture partner that's diverse and help develop. So that's one approach that we take, especially in the States. And then the other approach really is to make those companies more sustainable, and we want to start them on the journey. I've heard a fairly scary statistic or data point from some of the partners we were potentially looking at for us to help decarbonize the supply chain, that only 20% of the companies that they work with have actually started on the journey. 80% have not. And so that is a lot of education to go through. I'm hoping it's not, but yeah, basically what we're trying to do there is we're leveraging EcoVadis, which does have a cost of between sort of 500 and 1800 US per year per supplier, but it's a lot better than spending 50 to 100,000 going through a sustainability assessment. And that gets them on the journey, that gets them looking at their environment, labor, human rights, ethics, and sustainable procurement, and where their gaps are. And then we can start building up from there. But yeah, we've found that the first decent step is EcoVadis and using that. And then that also shows their level of commitment to the ESG journey. If they're not willing to spend $2,000 on EcoVadis and go through that process, then are they willing to spend more money to go through the decarbonising requirements that ourselves and our clients and governments will be asking them to go through? So we're sort of testing as we go along using EcoVadis.
Thanks, Matt. Michael, perhaps a question for you. What kind of challenges are you facing in introducing ESG to a client? Are there any strategic approaches that you've used, and how well and long has it been received?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd like to maybe say just in general, I think the biggest challenge you have with ESG is, and I think Matt just talked about it as well, is how do you combine business objectives and ensuring you got the right suppliers that support your strategic objectives, and how do you bring those things together? What I've seen work really well, at least in my past, especially in coming out of retail, is to articulate to your respective leadership and the company you represent is where ESG makes sense and why it's a good idea, because it does give you, it helps you de-risk your supply chain. Typically those smaller suppliers, yeah, they're more local, but their lead times are better, they're more nimble, they're often much more agile. Often they drive innovation. I've seen smaller suppliers in my supply chain in my past, especially when I bought hard goods, which of course at Coupa I don't really do a whole lot of, that actually helped me drive innovation and gave me a competitive edge and allowed me to have things in my environment that no other retailer had. And so, I've seen firsthand how ESG actually is good for business. Not to mention, of course, that it's, typically it drives local community and it engages local community in a way that, typically the larger organizations don't. So having the right strategy, I know, is beneficial for good business. We don't prescribe to our customers, if you will, like what they should be doing for ESG. We enable it, and Matt is a great example of that, and support it. But when I, in my past, was focusing on ESG, I would sell it internally. I hope that answer gave something to think about.
Thank you, Michael. Matt, another question for you. The Australian labour rates you mentioned, is CBRE only, or are they public access? And what do you consider for ESG audits with key suppliers, and how often?
Yeah, those labour rates there, I think we've bought them. I don't know the detail, to be honest. The person can reach out to me on LinkedIn and I can find out what they are. And then from, sorry, what was the second half of the question?
And what do you consider for ESG audit with key suppliers, and how often for the audits?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things is actually define what ESG means to you. and your company. So when I studied sustainability, 20 odd years ago, there were 78 official definitions of sustainability. And so, I mean, that's great, right? Because everyone got behind it. But then when you actually start getting the detail and saying, well, what am I going to do? You're like, well, it depends on the definition. So I think defining clearly what ESG is to you is important, and that will then help define what type of audit scope. What we do from a supplier audit perspective is we have quite a lot of monitoring that we do using likes of WorldCheck at the moment, moving over to Moody's, because they've got kind of a wider breadth of monitoring, building it into the Coupa RPMA platform as well will help on the monitoring. And then from an audit, we're basically taking the majority of our supplier code of conduct and managing against that. You can go further down to modern day slavery, and I think we will do some aspects of that. With the Australian legislation, we've basically got a question, actually I think 7 questions when we onboard suppliers to understand their level of maturity within modern day slavery in Australia. And depending on that outcome, then if they're sort of amber, then we send them information to kind of upskill them. If they're red because they've had an incident in the last 10 years, then we require they go through EcoVadis, and then a proper assessment and the monitoring, the adverse media monitoring kind of comes through there. So we've built different risk levels depending on the suppliers. We onboard them and engage them on an annual basis, and we want annual attestations for the modern day slavery and other bits. And then from that actual supplier audit against the supplier code of conduct, we've got 137,000 suppliers, so we've got like quite a bit of work to get across those, which is why we're totally focused on coming down to a relatively small number that we look to audit like every 3 years.
Great, thank you, Matt. We have come to time, and I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of CIPS. Thank you so much both to Matt and Michael for your time. Thank you to Coupa for sponsoring today's webinar, and to everybody out there listening, thanks for participating and engaging with this session. It's been absolutely terrific. I encourage you before you leave to fill out the survey, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next CIPS webinar. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.